Well, we want to welcome those who are joining us online, and if there's those that are out on the patio, we welcome you too. But I must say that it is sweet to see so many of you three-dimensionally again. What a joy it is. To have this reunion. It is like a family reunion. Well, it was 1980-something, and the lecture hall at Southern Methodist University, SMU, was packed, and the event had been advertised for weeks. One of the great Christian apologists of our time was going to debate a philosophy professor from SMU about the existence of God. It was a classic Christian atheist kind of a showdown. Now, the Christian happened to be a professor from the school that I went to. I was in seminary at the time. I was taking classes from him. He was a brilliant, brilliant man, and I was anxious to see how he did in an unscripted back and forth debate. Several of my seminary buddies were there along with me, and we couldn't wait until our professor unleashed his arguments on this unsuspecting philosophy professor. And as the debate began, it unfolded as we imagined, quoting famous Greek philosophers as well as theological minds like Augustine and Aquinas. Our professor just eviscerated his opponent. It was almost embarrassing, and we were relishing every moment of it. But then there was this pivotal moment in the debate, and I remember it vividly, when the philosophy professor, when it came time for him to give a rebuttal, said, "I yield my time," meaning he had nothing else to say. And the breath just got sucked out of the room, and everybody is wondering, what is this Christian professor now going to do? Now, the unfortunate thing was he kept going. And rather than sort of graciously beginning to talk to the man who kind of turned belly up, he kept at it and at it and at it until by the end of the time, I don't believe there was, as my personal opinion, I don't believe there was a soul that was moved closer to God. He won the debate, but he lost the war for the heart and soul of men. Now, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 in a mini-series called The Mind of Christ, and we're learning about what it means to think and feel like Jesus. And today we'll talk about the place of persuasive arguments and eloquence. And for all of us who look at articulate speakers and we say, "Oh man, if only I could say it like so-and-so says it." I've heard people say, "If only I could say it the way you say it, Pastor," and I say, "If only I could say it the way this other guy says it." We all do this. And we're going to address that mindset today. So I would like for you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And as you're turning there, I will remind you that we started at the end of this chapter. So we kind of did things out of order. We started last week. And again, we're just in chapter 2 for 4 weeks. We started at the end of the chapter, and we looked at what the goal is. The goal is learning to think like Christ, having the mind of Christ. And we learned that it's the opposite of thinking like the natural man. The natural man does not see a spiritual dimension in the world. He only sees things according to what he can see, taste, touch, feel, according to his senses. That's what he believes. And we talked about the knowledge of the existence of the spiritual world can make us able to spiritually appraise. That was the phrase that he used. We can spiritually appraise all things. We can use discernment. We can use the mind of Christ that we have been given to be able to discern the information that's coming at us. And wouldn't this be great? I mean, don't you feel like information is just being blasted at you at light speed? And so there is this desire that we all have. Lord, help me to process all of this information that's coming at me. And the Bible would say to us, the great encouragement, you can have the mind of Christ. And we learned last week, it is a choice that we must make. as Christians. Now let's start filling in what the mind of Christ looks like. And today what we're going to see very simply, the mind of Christ, first and foremost of all, focuses on Christ. Seems pretty simple. But let's look at verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. And when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. Now, some translations say testimony of God, others say mystery of God. Either way, it's referring to the same thing. It's saying what God has to say about his Son. That's what I'm saying to you. This is what Paul says. I came not telling you what Paul thinks. I'm not here to give my opinions. Paul says, I came here to give you the testimony about what God has revealed about his Son. And this is the core of the message. I'm relaying a message to you. It is not a moral code. I'm not telling you the eightfold path to get to heaven. I'm not giving you 5 pillars on which to build your life, moral principles. This is not a lesson in ethics. I'm giving you the testimony about a person named Jesus Christ, who was God's Son. And then Paul speaks about the way in which he approached the Corinthians. It wasn't with spellbinding big words, or as he says here, a superiority of speech. In other words, he says, when I came to you, I didn't show off my education. I'm not here to impress you with that. And we find out later that Paul actually didn't make a very good first impression on the Corinthians. When they saw him, they were unimpressed. As a matter of fact, in 2 Corinthians 10:10, we find out, and picture yourself the Apostle Paul. You hear this is what people are saying about you. They said his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech is contemptible. Paul, sorry, dude, you're not much to look at. Not only that, the way you talk is just so contemptible. And he also disappointed the Corinthians in that he couldn't even wow them by quoting all the Greek philosophers and talking about wisdom. In other words, what Paul says is, when I came to you, my purpose was not to wow you or to impress you with eloquence. I just proclaimed to you the message of Christ. He says in verse 2, look at verse 2. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, believe it or not, that is a busload full of meaning there. Why would you want to limit your knowledge? Wouldn't it be great to have as much knowledge as you can, and you could be conversant on every topic and every issue, and you could be relevant, and you could speak in all these different ways? Doesn't sound wise. It sounds like he's putting blinders on. You remember the 1970s show Hogan's Heroes, and Sergeant Schultz, is famous for, I see nothing, I see nothing. Is this what Paul was saying? I see nothing but Jesus, that's all I see here? Is he even against knowledge? Would he tell your children not to go to college? That's just a waste of time. Don't worry about that. You don't need all of that here. What does he mean? Well, first of all, notice that he says he determined to do this, meaning he thought about this beforehand. And with reason and logic, he decided, I'm not going to approach it this way. So he's not against reason or logic. You can't use reason or logic against reason or logic, because you're using the very thing. It becomes self-defeating, you see. You cannot do that. This was a strategic move, a decision, a choice that he made on his part to say, look, when I come to these folks, I'm going to zero in on Christ to the exclusion of everything else. And we wonder, well, why did he do that? Why did he do that here? Because most likely he had heard that the Corinthian church was getting sucked into a divisive intellectualism. Theories like Gnosticism were prevalent. You say, well, what's Gnosticism? Gnosticism was this idea that there was a hidden secret knowledge that only the elite could find out. And that was very prevalent. The arrogant intellectualism of the city had crept into the church even, and it was creating division. And so Paul knew that you don't fight intellectual arrogance with more arrogance. You see, the Greeks were very proud of their history of philosophy. They had developed over time from Socrates the Socratic method of learning, which we use today. My children are a part of it. It's brilliant, actually. And you learn by going back and forth, and you discuss ideas. It's tremendous. From Aristotle, they learned Aristotelian logic. I learned that myself in school. It's fantastic. But they exalted these men who were articulate, and they began to relate to each other, judge each other according to knowledge. And that was wrong. And in contrast to that, Paul says, when it came down to what I wanted to be known for, I only want to be remembered for one thing, for Christ. Now here's the amazing thing. He had the ability to argue anybody under the table, so it was not for a lack of ability. Paul was like a guy who had a black belt in martial arts, who chooses not to fight this novice who's trying to pick a fight with him. It would be like saying he had a PhD from Oxford or Cambridge. He studied under one of the most respectful men of his time, a man named Gamaliel. We would, in our day, put him on the plateau of a guy like C.S. Lewis, even beyond him, because he brilliantly was able to put together how the Old Testament and the New Testament fit together. How does Jesus fit with the Old Testament sacrifice? You read the book of Romans, and it's an incredibly brilliant book. And yet he made a conscious decision to limit the scope of his teaching to Jesus. He laid aside his credentials. This is important. His vast learning and study. And he did something called ministering in the opposite spirit, meaning he approached Corinthians in a way that they did not expect. He challenged arrogance with three things: humility, simplicity, and focus. Humility, simplicity, and focus. Paul was not opposed to using his intellect. We learn in other places, when he went to Athens, he was able to argue with the philosophers on Mars Hill. So he could let out the throttle when he felt like it was appropriate. But there's something attractive, isn't there, when somebody's intelligence is under the control of love, and it's guided by humility and focus. Knowledge usually puffs us up. The smarter one gets, the more insufferable they become. But this is not true with Paul's kind of knowledge. He was humble, sincere, and concentrated on one thing. And I don't know about you, but I find that so beautiful. I find there's a loveliness to that. When Paul would talk about anything, he made Christ central. He would always bring his various discussions back to Christ. You could drop Paul into any discussion about any topic, and sooner or later he would bring it back to Christ. Why? Because he saw the world through the lens of the cross. That's what it means as we put together the pieces of what it means to have the mind of Christ. This is what it means to have the mind of Christ. We see everything through the lens of the cross of Christ. And then we do something like we mentioned last week. We spiritually appraise it. We discern that. And then we have something to say that's of importance, great importance. Now, in the next verse, we get a very personal glimpse of Paul, and it's astounding at his vulnerability here. And it's an example of what it feels like to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. Look at verse 3. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. Three things. Look at that. Weakness, that's a lack of confidence, timidity, feeling of inadequacy. Fear, there was alarm, fright, and trembling. He was shaking, quivering. Now, I want to put that in context to the traveling philosophers of the day that would come through Corinth. It was very common for these men to practice their shtick, what we would call, that one speech that you could hone to perfection. And then when you came into town, you sandbagged it by getting up there and act like you're talking off the cuff, and you give this brilliant, eloquent speech that you've done, and you're just reeking with confidence. And in fact, you're adoring the crowd, and you love the attention. And there was many people like that, traveling philosophers, reeking of arrogance. And so Paul is contrasting himself, and he says, that's not the way I came. When I came, there was a weakness that I felt. And it wasn't a weakness compared to men or comparing himself to other men. It was a weakness that he felt for the inadequacy of the task. It's that weakness that you feel when you realize, God, if you don't come through here, nothing's going to happen. Realizing that these men with their eloquence were not changing the world. Paul was not interested in entertaining people. He was not interested in being a flash in the pan in the moment where everybody would say, wow, that was such a great sermon, Paul. Thank you so much. No. He had no confidence in his own gifts. And he said, Lord, I'm here and I'm weak and trembling. It's got to be you. I can remember when I started at the Chinese church, I was coming in as a pastor, working with the English ministry. And it was filled, our church was filled with people that had PhDs in physics. And if you know me, physics is not my thing. That's putting it mildly. And so I had this person come up to me who obviously assessed me as not being the brightest bulb in the box. And he said to me, are you intimidated by all this brain power? And he was serious, and I knew he was. And I said, if I thought I had to compete with them, I would be. And then I preached my first sermon on this passage because I did come to them in weakness and in fear and much trembling, knowing that here I am, the whitest white guy that you could find that had no clue what Chinese culture was all about. Being put into a room full of guys with physics degrees, men and women, worked for NASA and whatever. I mean, it was just, and what did I have to offer them? Nothing. Nothing but Christ. And I learned over time that was enough. That was enough. Paul would think, how could he, a simple man, break through the strangleholds of all this godly thinking? He thought to himself it was more than just words. It's going to take more than words. That's exactly what he says in verse 4. Look at verse 4. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And so Paul sets up a contrast of methodology here. How do you influence people? It's exciting to me that today, more than I've seen in a long time, there's a lot of young people that want to make a difference in the world. How do you make a difference in the world? I've heard it said over and over again, you want to be a light bulb or a laser beam. Both use light. One is very powerful, one is not so much. How do you become an influencer? How do you shape those around you? How do you make a difference in this world? We all want to know that. We want to think that our lives may be counted for something. And usually we try to persuade other people with clever words. That's actually what he says here. We think by boxing people in, backing them into a mental corner, that will bring people to Christ. Or we'll argue our point. But that is never the case. It wasn't the case with my professor at his debate at SMU. Persuasive arguments did not win the day then, nor now. But what does turn people's hearts and minds to God is when the Spirit of God moves in power through the lives of his people, when there's real transformation, when the gospel message that we talk about actually becomes lived out and incarnated, when the word becomes flesh again in our lives. That's what has power. You can argue with words, but you can't argue with a changed life. I watched a prayer vigil from Lynchburg, Virginia the other day. It was done in the city square in front of a massive monument, and the TV crews were out there, perhaps waiting for a fight to break out. But what happened instead was a beautiful demonstration of God's ability to unite people, black and white. Hundreds and hundreds of African Americans, hundreds and hundreds of white folks came together, all different churches, around the lordship of Jesus Christ. And in the city square of Lynchburg, they lifted up and they simply exalted Jesus Christ. That's all they did. There was no arguing, no fussing. They faced the issues. They said some pretty hard things. They didn't try to dodge things. But what they did, more than anything else, is they lifted up Jesus Christ in that city square. And there was no arguing with that. How do you argue with that? I think the world is stunned when they see that. And right now in our country, we need to see that. We need to be a demonstration of the healing power of Jesus Christ, the reconciling power of Jesus Christ. We need to demonstrate that now. So there's a marvelous strategy here. Do you see what Paul is doing? He's saying, don't complicate the matter. Don't let the gospel of Jesus Christ be affixed to anything else. Don't dilute it. When you dilute the power of Christ by attaching it to anything else, then it becomes a light bulb, not a laser beam. So critical for us to emphasize in our plainness the power of Jesus Christ. I've heard, because I've never actually been to a flower show, but I hear that if you go to a flower show where they're displaying these beautifully grown flowers, that they display them in plain pots. Because they don't want you, when the judges go by, they don't want you looking at the pot, they want you looking at the flower. You can see the analogy, can't you? Oh, that we would be a plain clay pot. That when people looked at us, they would see Jesus Christ. They would not see, wow, that person is so talented. Wow, that person has a tremendous music ability. Wow, that person's incredible speaker, artist, whatever. But what would stand out the most is a person whose soul was on fire with God and who passionately loved Jesus. And then he ends in verse 5 here by saying this. Why should we do this? Why should we emphasize the plainness? Verse 5, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of man, but on the power of God. Isn't it often the case that we put our faith in great teachers or musicians with tremendous gifts? I mean, I've heard it so many times. A gifted musician comes up and he's like cranking on the guitar. And everybody's just going crazy. And people will say, man, wasn't he anointed? It's like, no, he was just a good guitar player. He was fantastic at that. We mix that up somehow in our minds. Or we hear someone who is just a brilliant speaker, and we talk about how powerful they were. Well, sometimes they're just a great speaker. They can run phrases together, and we can be impressed by that. Again, we need to spiritually appraise all things. I learned this week that a man that I greatly admire, Pastor Tim Keller, who was pastoring up in New York for a long time, has pancreatic cancer. And this has greatly saddened me. I hope you'll pray for him because he's one of my heroes that I look up to. And of course, last week we just lost Ravi Zacharias. one of the great apologists of our time. And both of these men could go into the lion's den of hostile critics, and they were able to speak the truth in love. And, I think to myself so often, if I could only say it the way Tim Keller said it here, if I could remember the phrase that Ravi Zacharias said. I do this all the time because this is sort of my profession, is speaking. So I try to perfect my craft by learning how to speak like someone else. God has to remind me, what are you doing, Scott? Did I make you to be Ravi Zacharias? You're no Tim Keller. Stop trying to be Tim Keller. Be yourself. Be who you are. Because in your plainness, you can do the same thing that they're doing. Because both Tim Keller, both Ravi Zacharias, and many other wonderful pastors, gifted men that we have now, they just exalt Christ. And you know what? You can do that too. I know what you're thinking. You think you got this unsaved friend, and you think, man, if I could just get him this YouTube video of Ravi Zacharias, then they'll become a believer. I'll give them this book. I'll send them to this link on YouTube, and they'll hear this great speaker, and they'll come to Jesus. Here's the thing. We've got it all wrong, friends. I praise God for people like that. I don't know of anybody personally, maybe you've heard of somebody who said, I had a Christian friend give me a book, and through that I came to Christ, or I listened to a YouTube video. No. But I've heard a lot of people say, I had a friend, and they loved Jesus. And yeah, we talked about Ravi Zacharias, and we talked about Tim Keller, we talked about these things, but it was my friend that really touched my heart. Do not put your faith on the wisdom of men. Do not put your faith in the talents of other men. Put your faith in God. The power of God can come in a simple man or a simple woman. It is our commonness that can be that plain pot, that can be a wonderful demonstration of God's ability. That's what the word power means there, is God's ability to change and transform. That's what I want to be. Simple men and women have changed the world. One such man was a guy named Nicholas Herman. He was born in 1611 in France. At 18, he became a soldier. After that, he was a servant in a household. He was what they called a footman, which was, the guy that stood by the carriage and helped you get in the carriage. It's a great career to aspire to, isn't it? I'm going to grow up and be a footman. Eventually, he walked into a monastery one day, and he said, I want to be here to give my life to God. He said, what can you do? Not much. What's your education? Not much. They put him to work peeling potatoes in the kitchen. And so he went there. And pretty soon, people began to see something different about this guy, because no matter what he was doing, he could be cleaning pots, he could be peeling potatoes, or he could be at Vespers in the morning, he could be at evening prayers. He was the same the whole time. And there was an infectious joy that he had no matter where he went. They changed his name to Brother Lawrence. You may have heard of him. His friends called him Laurie, and they began to seek him out for advice. And it didn't go over too well when people started coming to the monastery. And so the guy would say, who are you here to see? I'm here to see Laurie. And the priest weren't too excited about that. He's just a layman. He's just a layman. He hadn't gone up through the ranks like the rest of us. And so he was called naive. He got his fair share of criticism. But by the end of his life, not only priests, but bishops were coming to him for spiritual guidance, because here's what they could sense in him. A simple man that you could tell walked with God. He had the presence of God in him. And that's why so many people were hungry to spend time with him. He never had the desire to write a book. Fame was something that he ran from. But when he died, his friends got together and said, you know, I have some great letters that Lori wrote me. And this other guy, hey, I got some letters too. Let's put them all together. And they did, into a book called Practicing the Presence of God. And millions of people all over the world have been ministered to by Brother Lawrence through the letters that he wrote to his friends. A simple guy cleaning pots, peeling potatoes, changed the world because he had the presence of God in him. He was a living example of what Paul says here. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. We often make things more complicated than we should be. We're often trying to be something we're not, or thinking that we don't have what it takes. We have everything it takes because we have Christ. Now, the question I would leave you with is this: is there some passion of yours? Is there some opinion that outshines Jesus in your life? There should not be. We should determine even now to say at the end of our lives, I want people to say about me, man, all they ever wanted to talk about was Jesus. I hope that is said about me in my last days. Let's pray. Father, you have given us all that we need. We thank you for this lovely message. What a lovely message that we see here in 1 Corinthians 2. That through humility, simplicity, and focus, when we put our faith in you, not in our education, although that's a wonderful privilege to have, not in our talents, each one of them gifted to us by you, so thank you for that. But we put not our faith in these things. We would be that plain clay pot. We would be that simple man, that simple woman that burns with a zeal and a passion for Christ. Make each one of us that are present here today, that are listening online, to be that person, that man or woman, to shine brightly for Christ. We pray in his name. Amen. I'm going to ask Tom to come up, and we're going to